we may have some editorial members joining us in progress, so we'll have some people join us at the table, but we've got Brianne Fannenstiel here, who is our chief political reporter, and Carol Hunter, executive editor. So let's start with you, Senator Ernst. Just tell us what you'd like to say.
You bet. Thanks, Kathy, and congratulations to you on your somewhat new position as well. I am very excited about your opportunity here. Thanks. And just would like to say thank you very much, because this is a great platform for us to talk about some of the issues that are out there and to be able to share some of the great successes that I have had working with our colleagues in not only the Iowa delegation, but the unusual friendships that we have had the opportunity to develop across the United States Senate as well. And I would like to start by sharing one of the really great successes, which was just published a little bit ago. We have secured funding for the Cedar Rapids Flood Mitigation Project, and this is one of the primary projects that I have spent my time working on in the United States Senate. One of the very reasons I moved on to the Environment and Public Works Committee was because of the platform we had to work with different types of infrastructure projects, whether it's a large infrastructure package, which we would like to see in the near future, but also these individual projects that are really important to the state of Iowa. And the folks in Cedar Rapids have suffered a long time with unusual flooding events. And the reason I take this so personally is because I served during their first flood event back in 2008 as a National Guardsman on the ground there. And so I saw firsthand the devastation that that community went through, whether it was the residential areas, the city works areas in the downtown area, and understand how hard it was for them to overcome and the economic damage that that created throughout the community. So I spoke with the city manager, Jeff Pomerantz, just a little bit ago, and I was getting a little choked up about it because we've worked so hard on this issue, and to be able to get that done now, they can move ahead. They won't have families worrying about the next flood event. So the goal now is to get that funding into their hands and get the flood wall completed. So he was just ecstatic. I'm ecstatic, and it comes down to, I think, just determination, not taking no for an answer, figuring out the way to move forward, and developing those personal relationships within the administration that have enabled us to receive the funding. So we had to work through a lot of different hoops with the Army Corps of Engineers. So I want to thank General Todd Semonite for being so respectful of the issue and really pushing for us. We appreciate that. The Assistant Secretary of Civil Works for the Army, R.D. James, he was very instrumental in making sure, and he understands river issues. And so he knew rural America, he knew river issues, and he was a really big promoter for us in getting this done. And then OMB Director Mick Mulvaney worked very hard with us on this. And in one of our conversations, he said, Joni, I'm from a rural area in South Carolina. He said, I understand how all these big metro areas get all the funding. And so he has been very instrumental as well in working on these rural issues for us. So that's one of the successes that we can take away, and just really working very hard, being very persistent, raising the issue with all of the right people, and developing those relationships where they would take my calls was very important. So that's our success for today. We have secured, the announcement indicated $117 million of funding. At least 78 of that will be what the federal government will put up towards the project, and then using inflation and other metrics, then the federal government will fund the project.
A question about the project, because they had talked a lot with the federal government about whether it would be just on one side of the river or if they were going to be able to protect both sides of the river. What's the scope of this?
And it's very preliminary right now, Kathy, and I do anticipate that we will be able to secure that federal portion. At least one side, of course, would be done, but then the talk has been about getting both sides of the river done. A lot of the corporations in Cedar Rapids have already put forward money for their own various areas throughout that corridor. And so I hope that we can get both sides done now with this amount of money.
I wanted to ask kind of a step back question. You referenced how places like Cedar Rapids, frankly, any place in Iowa, would have a hard time in the kind of the criteria system that the Army Corps used compared to New York City or San Francisco or places with higher real estate prices. Have you been able or will you push to make a broader change in that policy?
We already have, and that's another success that we have had is when we first started struggling with the Cedar Rapids issue, it brought to light the fact that they use a benefit to cost ratio, which will always favor higher dollar property areas like our coastal regions, our metro regions. And so what we have been able to do, and this was done in the WRDA bill this year, we were able to get a different mechanism put in place. So they still will use a benefit to cost ratio, but those with the higher property values will still be able to secure funding, but then we'll have a secondary tranche of money that will be dedicated to areas like ours, rural areas where our property values are much lower, so that they will also have an opportunity to compete for those dollars. So we will have still one system where high dollar areas can compete, and then a lower dollar competition as well. So we have had a number of successes there. I can't do it all alone. I do have a great staff that has been right there with me. We continue to push, driving that policy and doing the research and finding the areas that we need to correct in what exists in our law today. So sometimes it's not as beneficial for rural America. And I understand the needs of rural America. And so that's what we're driving for, is making sure that Iowa has the same opportunities as places like New York City or Los Angeles or other areas.
I think it's a big step forward, but major flooding events in Iowa are coming more and more often. We're just now struggling with the latest one in Des Moines and around the state. Plus, there's other weather-related disasters all around the country. The fire season is almost all the time now in California and the West. We've got hurricanes. So, I mean, besides writing disaster assistance checks, which the Congress has been doing, is there a more long-term plan that's needed, or that you would suggest to mitigate this future
Well,
flooding?
and I think there are many ideas out there, and that's why I was so adamant when I spoke to OMB Director Mick Mulvaney in stressing the fact that we do need a flood wall protection plan in place for Cedar Rapids. What we have spent on disaster recovery far exceeds the dollars that we would have spent in preventing it in the first place. So we do have to invest our dollars wisely, and I will just use one example of where I think we can do much better. When we talk about flood events, which is what Iowa seems to really struggle with the most, increasing weather events that cause severe flooding, is looking at ways, okay, if we know that these flood events are going to happen, how do we mitigate? So whether it's a flood wall protection plan, like what you might see in Cedar Rapids, or something that I think is a very smart idea, and that is utilizing conservation techniques, floodplain management. A number of communities have established flood mitigation projects that include wetlands. And so when flood events occur, those wetland areas do fill up. There's room for that water to go expand without creating a major event within the urban area. So I think there are ways that we can plan and be smart about it. We do have flood studies that are done at the University of Iowa, and I have visited the center there. So what we need to do is tap into those resources, find out, okay, where's the next likely flood event? How can it be mitigated? And it does take years to plan and prepare some of these measures, but I think that we can invest dollars wisely by doing that.
At some point, you have to ask, though, we're spending a lot of time trying to mitigate the effects, but what are we doing toward the causes. And I know that the causes of climate change or global climate change is controversial, but there are still ways that the federal government could be mitigating, for example, the carbon emissions that might maybe slow down the frequency of these weather effects. Is that part of what you are interested in doing on the environment?
I think there are different ways of approaching this issue. And so you do have those that are out there really pounding their hands about climate change, and then there are those that are conservationists, maybe have a little different approach. You have all these different groups. But I think if you look at it, the end result that we all want to see, regardless of what stance we're taking, is that we do have a cleaner, healthier environment. Our approaches are different. Now, here in Iowa, I love the fact that we are a leader in renewable energy sources. And what Iowa has been able to do with solar energy, especially wind energy, is examples that the other states should be utilizing as well. So just in visiting with the new CEO of Mid-America, their energy division, just last week, after they get done with their new wind energy field, Iowa as a whole, including some of the other energy companies, we will draw about 80% of the electric we use in Iowa from wind energy, clean, renewable energy. So if we can promote development like that and find a way that those that might consider themselves more progressive, as well as those that consider themselves very conservative, if we can bring them together in promoting ways to get this technology into other states, I think we're all winning. I just have a different way of approaching it than maybe some other members that I might work with on these issues. But I think the ultimate goal is to find a way that we're promoting a clean, sustainable environment.
How do you feel right now about the future of the RFS, as long as we're talking about renewable energy, the renewable fuel standard? I mean, is it still under the gun, do you think?
I am always concerned, Kathy. And while I think that we have pushed off what could have been very detrimental to the RFS with the executive order that was brought to President Trump about a month or so back, we have gotten to a point where he has agreed he will not support that. He does not want to do anything that would harm the farmers when it comes to that RFS order. And so I think we're okay for now, but does that mean we're okay next year? Kathy, I think this is one that we will continue to fight. We will have to. I think we have been undercut through many, many years. I'm not saying, not just this administration, but for many, many years, we have been undercut when it comes to the renewable fuel standard. And so I will continue to fight for the RFS. We see it as a clean energy source. It's very helpful for our growers here in Iowa, as well as our ethanol producers. And it is sustainable. It is sustainable. What had been proposed by Senator Cruz of Texas was to take the renewable identification numbers, attach them to export ethanol, which to me that undercuts domestic consumption of a renewable fuel. That goes against the congressional intent of the RFS.
How much of this problem right now do you think is just Scott Pruitt?
Probably 90%.
I mean, is there anything that can be done about that?
Well, I have obviously made my thoughts on him very clear. The president, and again, it is his decision whether to let him go or not. I would like to say that his time at the EPA is short-lived. But again, the president knows how I feel about this. Yeah.
You mentioned the president not wanting to hurt farmers on this issue. There's a lot of concern out there, though, about the tariffs.
I'm concerned about
and
it.
the situation there. There was some talk about a vote to prevent the president from essentially unilaterally making tariff decisions. He's using national security as his in on that. What's your position on that, and what else would you like to see done?
In today's day and age, especially when we are trying to leverage China to work with us on North Korea and others, we need to have all the tools necessary in the toolbox. Now, does that mean that there can't be checks put in place? I think the amendment that had been proposed, the talk that came from Senator Bob Corker, who is, I enjoy working with Bob Corker, but I think it was far too wide sweeping and just simply eliminating that tool. What I would like to see, and something that Senator Portman of Ohio has proposed, which is actually a point of discussion in the Finance Committee, is actually defining what is a national security issue. Okay.
What a concept.
What a concept. So it would still allow the president to utilize it, utilize the tariffs when national security called for it, but we would be the ones that define what are those national security issues.
Okay, so I'm gathering that you support that.
I do. I would support that, and I have not seen text, but it is part of their discussion again through the Finance Committee. But it is an approach that I would support. Because again, we are the ones that are defining the national security issues as we see them. Then the president still has that tool in his toolbox when he's working with tariffs and trade.
Is there anything else that can be done at this point? I mean, this is moving pretty far along.
It is moving pretty far along, and there are different issues. Now, the president is using the national security issue when it comes to tariff issues with Canada and Mexico. Not probably the right use. Again, I still want them to allow the leverage necessary, but let's define it. But with Canada and Mexico, when it comes to NAFTA, the last trade meeting that I was in with the president, he still does intend to have NAFTA done by early fall. Sometimes that's not the best news when we're talking to farmers that are seeing tariffs being placed upon their soybeans, their pork, whatever it might be. That hurts us in the short term. I don't want to see it hurt us in the long term either. So I do stay active with the president on trade discussions, whether it's phone calls or face-to-face meetings. He knows where we stand on this. He's still very optimistic that we get this done. He sees Mexico as being a good partner for us. He thinks at any point we can be done with a deal with Mexico. It's Canada that's the hang-up with NAFTA. So we, a number of senators in our last discussion, John Hoeven from North Dakota, myself, a number of other senators, we told the president that, okay, if Canada's the hang-up, seal the deal with Mexico, do a bilateral agreement, get them on board, let's do it now, let's move ahead. Mexico is the #1 importer of Iowa corn. So that's a good step in the right direction. They import a lot of our goods in Mexico. They're good partners to us. Canada, we have a long ways to go with Canada, but if they would see that we're engaging in a bilateral agreement with Mexico, it might increase the pressure on them a little bit more to jump on board.
Canada is also an important trading partner.
They are important, yes they are.
Yeah.
And I don't want to discount any of our trade partners, none of them. But if we do have a willing partner that's ready to move now and help lessen the burden that's placed upon our farmers, I would encourage the president to do that.
A lot of the discussion in the news has been about the situation at the border, and it's been moving quickly. But first it was family separation, now it's family reunification. The criteria that the Trump administration has put on asylum seekers, which makes it very difficult for families who are legitimately, seeking asylum. Where do you see this going, I guess, is the first question. Is there hope for a comprehensive immigration policy?
Well, I do want to state, I think I would like to see comprehensive immigration reform done. the hope for it, we have to have people that are willing to come together and let go and say, you know what, we're going to work together on this issue. It's a struggle right now on certain issues. You know, there are some issues that we come together and we work so well on. The Farm Bill is a great example of that. I think it passed through the Senate 87-11. Pretty big deal. We worked together. I wish immigration reform were like that as well, where we would come together and have 87 senators agree on one step forward. So I do think that there is hope. It may have to be done in smaller packages. And I think the example of family separation at the border is one example of where we can come together and find a pathway forward. So at least starting in a manner and addressing the issue at hand, which is making sure that we can keep families together, understanding that there are some that will legitimately need protections as asylum seekers, and finding a pathway forward for them. But what we don't want to do is continue to encourage just families that, of course, are looking for a better life, but we're encouraging them to do it in the wrong way. We do want them to go through proper legal channels. Go to the entry and declare yourselves as asylum seekers. Don't just try and cross the border at random places utilizing these illegal traffickers. It only encourages those illegal traffickers to do more of that.
But the port of entries were overburdened. They weren't accepting people.
And then
we changed the rules midstream. So I mean, aren't we making it really impossible for people to
I
do
wouldn't
it
say
right?
it's impossible, no, not at all. And there are a couple different bills that we have that are out there, and I am signed on to 2 of those, which would increase the number of judges that we have, administrative judges that we have taking up these cases, and set timelines too. They must go through the process within X number of days, 20 days. You either return the family if they are not here legally to seek asylum, and if they are, then they would be released to proper authorities within the United States. So I do think we have several bills that could be taken up. We just need to work together on those.
Is one of the places you think there could be agreement on kind of breaking up the issue involving the Dreamers?
Yes, but we tried that last year. And I think there was a very, very generous offer on the table that would have allowed a pathway to citizenship for over 1 million. Not just those that are registered DACA recipients, but those that are not registered as well. Very generous offer, and it was declined. So how do we move forward would be the big question.
Some other strings attached to that. If, given the time that's passed with no movement forward, if there were a totally clean Dreamer bill, no money for the wall, no other considerations, would you be willing to support that?
I would take a look at it. I will not say what I won't or will or won't support definitively without having the bill in front of me, because it seems no matter what we come up with, there always seem to be some sort of strings attached. So whether it is Republican or Democrat, there's always something that we have to sort through and make sure it makes sense. But I do want to see a bill come forward. But how do we stop others from entering illegally and being trafficked into the country? Those are issues that we need to work on as well. But we do recognize we have these young people. They're not children anymore. They are young men and women, and they exist in our communities. We need to figure out a pathway forward. But I just can't say that we would ever see what you would call a clean Dreamer bill come forward, because somebody always wants something. But we've got to find a way forward. So if somebody gets a little something here, then we would like to see a little something there as well.
Anybody else on immigration? Otherwise
welcome.
we can move on.
Hi.
Andy Dominic has joined us.
Thank you, Andy.
Oh, I wanted to ask.
Rushed here.
And thank you for that. Yeah, thank you for that.
You had been amenable to sending National Guard troops to the border to help deal with immigration, but a lot has happened since then. Do you still think that's a good idea? And under what conditions would you be willing to see your old colleagues in the National Guard go into the
And
border?
I do support that, and that certainly would be up to the administration and those governors that would be sending those troops to the border, again, for additional border security too. And what we saw, a lot of the discussion was organized human trains that were being pushed through Mexico to the border, maybe more so for a political statement. Certainly the individuals that were coming from Central America had opportunity to seek asylum in Mexico, and that is international law. But for whatever reason, then Mexican authorities did not allow them or offer asylum in Mexico. So there was a grave concern there that it was not necessarily done just for asylum. It was being done as a political statement from organized groups within Central America and perhaps even Mexico. So understanding American security comes first. American security should always be first. If there are true asylum seekers, those that are in dangerous situations, then we do need to take them into consideration. But the fact of the matter is they're being pushed through a country which also offers asylum, and they weren't given asylum.
Do you think that the need is still what it was for additional National Guard?
I don't know that it is now, but if that need arises, I would support the decision of our governors and the administration.
Did you talk about tariffs?
Oh, just a little bit, but if you had a question.
We
Well, I had a
did, but
question
yeah,
about-
that's certainly.
I had a question about some legislation you introduced just recently that would take nonprofit status or tax-exempt status from sports leagues. Can you talk about how that originated?
Absolutely. What we see is a lot of pro sports organizations that make millions and millions and millions of dollars every year have a non-exempt status, like the National Hockey League and others. And why is that? So those are dollars that should be coming into the federal government, but taxpayers subsidize that basically. So it has come about through a number of things. One, if we look at different sports activities in the past, and one that I've been active in really trying to get to the bottom of is the issue that we had with USA Gymnastics and the United States Olympics Committee and the sex abuse scandals that have occurred over decades now. They are a federally chartered organization and do many of their activities through basically nonprofit status. So when we start looking at that, okay, well, what about these organizations that are exempt from paying taxes? What about these organizations that are federally chartered? How do we go back and make it right? So
Is that the only one? I think it stood out to me because there's so many. I mean, cemetery companies, irrigation companies, credit union. When you go through the 501c,
there are so many. Yeah.
So that's why I wondered why that one was singled
Well,
out. And
it is because it is such a big business and it's millions of dollars. We shouldn't be subsidizing something that is not a necessity for, it's a fun activity. It's great that we can all go out and enjoy sports events, but you see how much these stadiums cost, and they have corporate sponsors as well, so that's great. But why should the American taxpayer subsidize that? They already pay for tickets.
And we've argued that for years. Are there other other
Oh,
organizations?
we will
listed
continue.
that,
We will continue looking at those and scrutinizing those. But I think that one was the one that, because timing is right on that, especially after we saw what happened with USOC. Let's look at the sports organizations out there. And
the thing that got you thinking about this was with gymnastics? Was
yes,
that
because we have so many issues there. And so it has all come together together. We started with the Olympic Committee really last year. Jean Shaheen and I have been working extensively on that. Dianne Feinstein led some legislation that I was on as well. But now's the time to act. When we're aware of what's going on in these sports organizations, how we encourage our young men and women to look up to our Olympic athletes, how we encourage them to look up to sports figures, and the return on the investment is, for the American taxpayer, I think is not there. It's time to make them squeal as well.
So it wasn't prompted by the NFL?
Not by the NFL. And like I said, it's the NHL, it's a lot of other organizations.
Do you know how much that would generate in revenue? If they...
I don't know the dollar figure. And I know that we'll probably get some sort of readout from the Congressional Budget Office. But Angus King and I have just introduced the bill, and so CBO will, I'm sure, take a look at that and let us know.
We're talking about taxes. Do you think the IRS is adequately funded?
Probably not adequately funded for all that we ask them to do, and especially with probably the reorganization right now that they will see, of course, with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But what we really need to do is make sure that we're streamlining our tax code. And I think we could have done a lot more streamlining in the tax cuts bill. We couldn't reach a consensus there. But there are a lot of federal agencies, I think, that really, they need to have adequate staff on board, and now just to make sure that this is successful, certainly.
So you would support increased funding for that?
Depending on, yeah, again, depending on how much it is and what activities we're increasing. Are we working on more folks out in the field to help taxpayers with tax issues, or are we just increasing the bureaucracy in Washington, D.C.? I don't necessarily agree with that. So my goal has always been to scale back federal agencies where it makes sense and make sure that those that are on the ground and actually working for our taxpayers are the ones that are funded. If you look at, and I have a bill out there as well, it's called the Swamp Act, that would move headquarters out of Washington, D.C. and out into the states where it makes the most sense. A lot of people are excited about this. Of course, lobbyists and folks in Washington, D.C. hate the idea because everybody is so central right there. They're easy to lobby, they're easy to push, but then taxpayers are footing the bill for office space that's 3 times the cost of what it would be to be located in Iowa or Kansas. I shudder every time I drive by the USDA. They're housed in downtown Washington, D.C., and they have thousands of employees, many of them who have probably never ever lived on a farm, don't have neighbors that they're accountable to. So I think it comes back to what is the benefit to the taxpayers, the folks on the ground. If it makes sense investing the dollars to make sure we're getting good customer service for Iowa taxpayers, then I think it makes sense. But if I'm just raising the salary of somebody who is already out working for the IRS, I probably wouldn't buy into that.
Did we talk about the VA?
No, we haven't. Let's talk about the VA.
I mean, that's something we've written about for years and about, I mean, would you support, I followed this, the Choice Act, and now this legislation recently, but would you
the VA
support,
Mission Act.
would you support closing some facilities, or the idea of just giving veterans insurance cards, you know?
I will look at any option as long as the veteran comes first. So I get a lot of pushback if I talk about, okay, allowing a veteran to choose to go to a local hospital rather than go to the VA. I get a lot of pushback from a lot of different people because they're like, no, they should go to the VA. We need the VA. We need the numbers at the VA, on and on and on. I'm sorry, but my job as a United States Senator and as a veteran is not to protect the VA. My job is to protect the veteran. And so if that veteran feels that they will receive a better service coming from a doctor that they know in their own community, I think we should enable that veteran to do that.
Congress has done a lot to allow them to do that.
And we have.
With the Choice Act, and then it sounds like the VA works really hard to to let people go to other doctors?
They do try and accommodate the best they can. And with the VA Mission Act, which I was a co-sponsor of, this is the latest piece of legislation that has passed through the Senate, has been signed into law by the President. It does allow for greater flexibility. It goes beyond what the Choice Act did. The Choice Act, it did have some parameters set on it. You had to live outside that 40-mile radius of the VA. The VA Mission Act allows the veteran and that veteran's physician to decide, yes, you will be better served by going to a local community hospital. You'll be better served if you can go into the VA clinic, which is 10 miles from you. The physician and that veteran will decide what their path forward is. And if that better serves the veteran and they're receiving quality care, then we should support that, and that's what we did.
That was just recently
It was
signed?
just
Okay,
signed
'cause
within the last month.
And is that, does that one, remind me, or maybe you know, does that make it easier to close some facilities possibly?
Not
Do you know?
necessarily, well, never say never. I'm not going to say never say never. I think our VA facilities do serve a purpose. So I'm not advocating that we close VAs. I want to make that very clear. Again, I'm not going to protect the VAs, but we have great docs and nurses that are working at those VAs, and there are still a lot of veterans that will choose to drive whatever distance it is because they feel at home in a VA center.
I've talked to many people who work there. They have a hard time finding enough staff. I mean,
It is very difficult.
And which leads to another question I have just about worker shortage generally in the country. We've written some about Iowa. I mean, we just do not have enough
Right.
workers.
No, we don't.
So what do you?
Healthcare workers.
Especially
Health
healthcare
workers,
workers.
but all workers. I mean, you're probably hearing this from
All the
businesses.
time.
So what's your?
All the time. And I'll start with as it applies to the VA and then just our shortage of healthcare workers just in general outside of the VA. So the VA does struggle to find doctors, nurses. They still have competitive salaries at our VA facilities, but again, it's part of a broader issue of healthcare worker shortages, not just in Iowa, but all across rural areas and then the United States as a whole. So we struggle at our VAs, particularly in the Midwest, because we're rural. Not a lot of people are jumping up and down about going into rural areas and serving communities that might be financially stressed or financially challenged. We do have a number of grants that allow for repayment of certain student debt if that physician or whatever healthcare worker decides to come into the rural areas. I think that's great to a point, but once their time is served, a lot of those physicians will move from the rural areas into more lucrative positions within the cities. So broader, Kathy, I think to your point is that we are not growing enough of our own physicians, our own nurses, our own specialists. Are there ways that we can capitalize on those coming from other countries? We have a lot of bright young men and women that are educated in our higher education system here in the United States. Why aren't we keeping them? My personal physician back in Red Oak was from the Philippines. He was educated in Minnesota and came to work in a rural area for repayment of some of that debt. It's great, and we hope that he stays on here in the United States. But he is moving from Red Oak now.
Is that a visa issue?
Yes. Well, it's not necessarily a visa issue. His visa was extended. But he will go on. He will probably gain his citizenship here in the United States. But how do we keep them then in the rural areas as well, rather than moving into a larger metro area where they will make more money?
But do we need more of like the H-1B visas that?
I would support bringing more in to be educated, absolutely, because we see it in the rural area.
Do have medical degrees, but got them in their home country.
And then as long as they are meeting the certification for the United States and to practice in whatever state that they would be practicing in, I think that we should work with that, absolutely. So now we will go through the recruitment process again at our community hospital and I'll switch doctors once again. It's a problem that's not unique to Iowa. I think we see this across the nation.
I know you've been frustrated about the pace of Congress dealing with the Affordable Care Act and healthcare in general. I mean, do you see a way forward at this point, or is it going to be sort of continuing to be a decline by attrition with the ACA premiums going up, people not being able to...
Hopefully we can find a way forward, and Lamar Alexander is highly respected in the United States Senate. He's the senior senator from Tennessee. He's also the chair of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee. And he has been very good to work with not just our Republican conference, but our Democratic conference as well. He's great about bringing subject matter experts in. We thought we had some, at least, near-term fixes that were being brought up earlier this year. They were blocked, though, in the Senate. And the odd thing is they were bipartisan measures, and they were blocked. So we've got to figure out a pathway forward that makes sense, first keeping our constituents in mind. But we've got to work together. It's just like the immigration issue. There seem to be a lot of potential solutions out there. They need to be bipartisan. They have to be bipartisan.
Do you come to a point where you say it's our leadership that needs to be changed here?
Quite potentially.
I mean, because you're saying you've got bipartisan support for some of these things, but they're not coming up.
Well, the blockage, though, happened. It was a combined bill that was originally sponsored by Patty Murray, who's the ranking member on Health, Education, Labor, and Pension, and Lamar Alexander. They had worked together on a measure. Susan Collins and Bill Nelson had also worked on a fix. So again, bipartisan measure. The two different bills were put together, and it did include the subsidy payments to the states. I do support that in the short term to help, support those that need the subsidies to pay for insurance, those that qualified. And then Susan Collins in Maine, when she was in Maine, they had a reinsurance program that worked very well, but was done away with when Obamacare was put into place. So she and Bill Nelson worked on that fix. Lamar and Patty worked on their fix, brought it together in one amendment. And the person that objected to bringing it up was Patty Murray.
Oh. So
she
didn't
was,
like the other one.
Well, the fact that it actually had opportunity to get done, and she was getting pressure, I think, within her conference. And so I was really disappointed. And I don't see Lamar lose his temper. He does not lose his temper. He is probably the most calm, rational person that we have in our conference. He was very upset. Susan Collins doesn't lose her temper. She does not lose her temper. She was very upset because what we saw as a window of opportunity to bring everybody together and really start working through this, and then one of the sponsors of the very piece of legislation we were taking up blocked it. So it's just at times like that, we just wonder, why do we work so hard on bipartisan pieces of legislation only to have it blow up at the nth hour? So it's when you're faced with situations like that, then how do we move forward now when we thought we had at least a potential fix? Not every Republican was going to love it, not every Democrat was going to love it, but that's probably when we're finding the path forward, is if we're giving a little bit and taking a little bit at the same time.
What did she say?
I don't know what her reasoning was. She objected to bringing up the measure. The opportunity was for us to vote on the floor, and it could have been that because we actually had a pathway forward, and I should stop there. I don't want to speculate, and I don't want to put words in her mouth.
How much does Trump, when Trump's changing positions, how much does that affect what's going on behind the scenes in Congress, whether it's immigration or the tweets?
I won't say it doesn't affect us, but what I try and emphasize to people is my job is to find a pathway forward. And so we do have to have administration buy-in because, again, if you're working so hard on an initiative, you want to know that if you get it to the White House, he's going to sign it. So it does have an impact. But as a senator, what we all should do as senators is to make sure we're focusing on a pathway forward that we think is viable, that we can get bipartisan support on. Because again, in the Senate, we have to have 60 votes. And that means you have to have Democrats on board to move an issue forward. So we stay focused on the issue at hand. We have to find a way forward. I do think that President Trump understands that, which is why he does include Democrats in some of the discussions that he has, whether it's trade, whether it's immigration, whether it's health care. You know, he's been very gracious to open the doors to anybody that wants to speak with him. He does that. At the end of the day, it's his decision on how he moves forward. But, you know, I stay focused. I work with my colleagues the best I can. And then we do have to sell the president on it. And even if he has a different idea on how to proceed, we still always have that window of opportunity to go in and present our ideas to him, really present a convincing argument. So I'm going to go back. Just an example of that is the RFS. We had an opportunity to deflect the president from making what I thought would be a very bad decision when it came to the RFS. And he did listen to us. And he did shift away from the policy that he was just about ready to sign. At the nth hour, again, he deflected. He decided, nope, I'm not going to go with the Ted Cruz proposal on the RFS because it was not what I wanted and it's not what our farmers wanted. So we still have an opportunity to influence decisions, but we have to work together in the Senate. For a bipartisan measure, it also has to meet the House's standards as well. So we have to juggle all of that, and it makes life difficult, but there's always opportunity to present arguments.
I apologize for being late.
No, thank you.
Have you brought up the Farm Bill yet?
We haven't.
Not yet, no. Boy, we've covered the gamut, but do you have some thoughts
Just
on the Farm
wondered
Bill?
how you think that's going. Where do you think we're going to end up?
I think we'll have to end up with a bipartisan Farm Bill.
What's that look like?
And hopefully it looks a lot like what we passed out of the Senate, because we did have overwhelming support there. And I think I'd said earlier, I think it was 87 to 11 when it finished in the Senate. So the House will have to give a little bit. We may have to give a little bit as well. I do think that Senator Roberts the chairman and ranking member Stabenow, they did a very good job at really working together for months. They have been working this for months, taking ideas from all of us, working with our concerns, bringing up the issues that needed to be included in the Farm Bill, and then allowing us to debate them in committee, those that maybe weren't as bipartisan. So I think we did the right thing in the Senate, and hopefully we can work with our House members in conference as well. Bottom line, Farm Bill has to get done.
Is there much in there for Iowa in terms of, or states like Iowa in the Midwest, for conservation and water quality and those kinds of things?
Yes, very much so. And a number of provisions that I had actually were put into the manager's package, which means they were not controversial. They were worked on in a bipartisan manner. One of those, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, the RCPP, what Ranking Member Stabenow and I did was work together on this to modernize it and allow for greater flexibility, greater partnerships within that program, which we think will be wonderful. It extends beyond the rural areas and allows for urban partnerships as well, which is really important, not just in the rural areas like Iowa, but if you start to get to more urban areas where they still need to practice conservation, they can have opportunity there as well. So we're broadening the scope of that, and again, allowing for different types of partnerships that we haven't seen in the past. So that's one really good step forward, and hopefully that's maintained as we move through conference. But also my GROW Act, which Sherrod Brown of Ohio was my primary co-sponsor from the Democratic side. Bob Casey was another one from Pennsylvania, and Chuck Grassley was another Republican co-sponsor. The GROW Act is, it focuses on the CRP, what we have. What we have seen is that a lot of retiring farmers are deciding, wow, this is pretty lucrative. I'm gonna put my whole farm in CRP and I'll retire to the South. That's not really the original intent of CRP. The original intent was to protect vulnerable acres from erosion and protect water quality. So we need to get back to the original intent of that law, and that's what the GROW Act does. So it does limit what farmers can put into CRP. They can't just put a whole farm in CRP without having it certified as highly erodible or vulnerable acres. A lot of people are upset about that, and maybe if I were receiving those CRP dollars, I would be too, but that wasn't the intent. There are other programs that they can engage in if they want to put, a farm into a different type of program. That's great, but that's not what CRP was for. So we have restricted the uses of CRP, and we think it will be much more beneficial. You run out of the number of acres allowed for CRP. We did bump that up a little bit. It was currently capped at 24 million acres United States wide. We upped it to 25 million acres, so it does allow for 1 million more acres that can go into those water conservation or soil conservation efforts. There are some other conservation activities within the bill as well, but those are some of the primary ones that Iowans participate in, and they'll have greater flexibility now. So I am really thrilled about that. I did have a number of measures that were included, so feel good about that step forward.
On the Farm Bill, most of what we've read about as far as the hang-up between House and Senate is the work rules out of the House. Is there anything else that you see as a major impediment?
I think that is probably the largest one that we have, and I don't necessarily think it's a bad requirement. It, I think, encourages work or job training opportunities for those able-bodied adults, and in my mind, able-bodied adults without dependents. That's kind of where we wanted to see the focus go. What we want to do is encourage people. Certainly the food security safety net is available for them, but we do want to encourage them to find a way to be productive within their own communities as well, given an opportunity. It is a small percentage of our population. Those single moms, they're moms, they have dependents. We weren't asking that of them, at least that's how I wanted to see it proceed. But what we want to see is people rising up out of poverty. We don't want to see people trapped in poverty. And so we think through the volunteer activities, assisting them with finding 20 hours a week of employment is a step in the right direction, as well as the job training opportunities or volunteer opportunities. So, it's still controversial in some groups, but I do think we're giving a helping hand. If we can provide them with that food security, then let's ask a little bit of help in our own communities to help them get on their feet. And it kind of rolls into my Empowers Act as well, which is a program that I would like to see in place, which allows our states greater flexibility within some of those federal assistance programs. So whether it's the food stamp program, whether it is child care programs, allowing states to kind of tailor those programs into what works for their citizens. So what we want to see is, and within this act, the Empowers Act, it allows states to slide people up out of poverty rather than face the fiscal cliff. And whenever I'm visiting with, especially our young moms that are out there, one of the greatest concerns they have is if I make, a nickel more an hour at my job, then I lose child care assistance. If I, take more hours at work, I'm going to lose my child care assistance. That's one of the number one concerns that moms have. Well, using the Empowers Act, we would allow them to slide up out of poverty. So rather than, okay, you're going to lose all your federal benefits, okay, you make a nickel more an hour, maybe we can ease back on maybe 2.5 cents. If you're making 5 cents more, maybe we just decrease by 2.5 cents what you're receiving in federal assistance, but we're not going to cut you off. Allow them to work their way up so that eventually they are on their own. That makes sense. That makes sense to the moms that I've talked to about that. We don't want to punish people for doing better, and that's what our federal government does right now. So we do have to find a way to help themselves out of poverty without being penalized, and we just shouldn't do that.
We're running short on time, but I did want to ask, looking forward to President Trump's nominee for the Supreme Court.
Right.
Are there certain criteria, attributes you want to see from that nominee?
It's the same as,
Iowa?
yes, I mean, somebody that will uphold our Constitution. Somebody from Iowa would be great. But someone that will uphold the Constitution, and people have asked me this before, and about religious litmus tests and so forth, and no, we should have no religious litmus test for any of our candidates. Again, I think just going back to the Constitution, and I hope that I do have the opportunity to meet whoever that nominee is and be able to vet them. I think that is really important. So there's a lot of unknowns so far. I do think the president is going to announce his nominee next week, so that will be exciting. I'll return to DC Monday. But one thing I want to point out, and I mentioned this on the media conference call last week, but here we do have an Iowan who is chairing the Judiciary Committee, who will now have an opportunity to vet and put forward a second nominee for the Supreme Court of the United States. I don't know that that's ever happened certainly not in Iowa history, but in the history of the United States Senate. How many chairmen of the Judiciary Committee have had the opportunity to do that, not once, but twice? I think it's pretty incredible. And so I need to give kudos to our senior senator, because I do think that he worked through the nomination process with Neil Gorsuch. I think he did very well in making sure that all of the senators, Republican and Democrat, had enough time to visit with the nominee one-on-one in their own offices, as well as during the full open hearing process. He allowed them multiple questions and enough time for them to get whatever questions they had out. So I hope that he will afford our nominee that same courtesy, as well as our other senators the same courtesy moving forward. But Chuck Grassley just did a tremendous job.
Are there any issues with a nominee that would, for you, be a non-starter?
No, I would say not a non-starter, no.
And are there any issues that you would bring up in your meetings with the nominee, which I assume they're all going to meet individually with the members?
Well, and I did have a list of questions that I asked Neil Gorsuch when he came in, and very much most of that is centered on the fact of, will you uphold the Constitution? Just very basic things like that. So yes, I would ask those similar questions of any other nominee that comes forward. And I would probably keep it the same. And I will say this, that, Constitution, upholding our Constitution, that would be the same whether it was a Republican nominee or a Democratic nominee. And I would say there's no non-starter issues. There's still one member of a court of appointed justices. They will all go through, hopefully, the same process that any of our modern justices will go through as well.
Criticisms, though, of some Circuit Court of Appeals nominees who wouldn't answer the question do you think Brown versus Board of Education was rightly decided? Are there any cases that you think are just unassailable?
I won't
like
say,
Brown versus Board
no,
of
I would
Education?
not say never. You're not asking if I would vote for them. You're asking, you know, if that would be a non-starter. I think there are a lot of issues, but certainly I would want to know where they stand on those issues, certainly.
And what would you say to somebody who is still very sore with the Senate for not moving the Merrick Garland nomination ahead? You know, whether he would have been confirmed or not, you know, is another matter. But some people, mostly Democrats, I'll concede, are still very angry with Senator Grassley and Senator McConnell for not giving Merrick Garland a hearing and a vote, which this newspaper has long said every nominee deserves. So what do you say to those people who say that was wrong?
I think the statement at that time was very much based upon what Vice President Biden had done many years prior. And he said, and we call that the Biden rule. That's called the Biden rule in the United States Senate. And he had said during a presidential election year, the people should make that decision. And the people made that decision, and we did have a new president, and that new president then selected.
In the same month of President Trump's tenure, if an opening comes up, do you think it'd be fair to do that at that
So
time?
in 2020, 2020,
Right, 2020.
right, which is the election year,
Right.
I think then that is fair to come around and say that as well.
No appointments late in Trump's
Until-
last term.
Until he goes
Last year.
through, right, until he goes through that election cycle, and when he is reelected, then he would be able to make the new appointment. So, but yes, I think that is absolutely, it would be absolutely fair. Of course it would be fair.
So that makes the Biden rule.
And the
in
Biden
effect-
rule.
In effect, it becomes a law, right?
Well,
It's
it's
hard
not
to
a
fathom.
law, but it would be
It's a law of the
precedence.
Senate,
It's
right?
precedent set. Precedent set. Yep. So come 2020, if there's an opening, I'm sure you'll remind me of that.
I know you're out of time, but do you have any regrets during your time in the Senate? Anything you wish
Absolutely
you'd done? No?
No, and you should never have regrets. I think that I move forward with Iowa always at the forefront. And there are times that I anger people because of my stance. I think hopefully not Iowans, but certainly other people. And I've not always been maybe the most ardent supporter of President Trump in certain circumstances either. But as long as I am respectful, we will maintain a good working relationship. As long as I am respectful with my colleagues, we will have good working relationships. And I value personal relationships. That is very important to me. And I think that's why I have been effective for the state of Iowa. And I really do. I didn't come in prepared to answer, you know, how many bills I've had signed into law and all of that stuff. But as a freshman senator, I would say, and I'm just guessing, so I know you'll go back and fact check me, but I would say that I've probably been one of the more effectual freshman senators just in recent years, because I do value relationships and I do work across the aisle. When it's good for Iowa, I'm going to work for it.
Is there any place, though, yet where you've parted ways with Republicans?
Oh, yeah.
Like,
I mean,
just give me a couple of
the RFS issue is most certainly an issue, and not just because it's not necessarily a conservative idea, where I've parted company there. Some great colleagues of mine that I agree with on nearly every other issue. They're adamantly opposed to the RFS because they see it as a federal mandate. And they don't like federal mandates. So I have parted ways there most certainly. That's probably one of the biggest examples that I've shown there. Now, issues of sexual harassment, especially when it comes to working in the Senate and policing our own. I have parted ways from my Senate leadership on that. They wanted to go one direction. I wanted to go a different direction with my partner in crime, Kirsten Gillibrand. Fortunately, we were all able to come together at the end, but it's only because we push so hard, and sometimes because I say, you know what, if you're not moving a little quicker, then Kirsten and I are going to do our own thing, and you may not be happy with it. And that forces them to move a little bit quicker. So, and then we do come up with a good product at the end. But I can't say regrets, and I think I am my own person, and people know where I stand. People here in Iowa know where I stand on issues. All they have to do is ask me. But again, it's always Iowa first, and we're going to fight for Iowans. We're going to fight for rural Iowa, just like we did. You came in a little bit late. I was kind of touting the most recent success, and that's we secured federal funding for the Cedar Rapids Flood Mitigation Project, and it was just announced about an hour or so ago. And it's because of the personal relationships and the fact that, honest to God, I was like a dog on a bone with this issue, and I wasn't going to let it go. There was a lot of opportunity in the last 10 years to get that done, and it didn't get done. So the folks in Cedar Rapids have waited far longer than they should have. They've been more than patient. We needed to get it done. We're at a point now where closure is just within sight. So working personal relationships, Iowa is always first. Iowa is always first. So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. Thanks for coming in. First time since you've been elected, so
yes,
we're very happy to have you here.
Thank
and
you.
I hope you are not a stranger. Please come back again.
Yes, thanks for extending the invitation as well, and congratulations to you, Kathy, and for everybody for joining us here, and thanks for allowing me the opportunity. And I do want to thank Iowans as well, because it's important for me to share my gratitude, and I am honored to be in this seat, and I'll continue working hard for Iowa.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.